professor of economics at the University of California in San Diego. Previously, he has taught at UVA, and he's worked at some of the Federal Reserve banks. Has PhDs in economics from Berkeley, and he is the recipient of numerous NSF, or National Science Foundation, grants for his work. He has spoken at conferences throughout the world and was ranked as one of the 50 most productive economists from 1984 to 1993. He is published in many economic and finance journals, and one of his more recent working papers is Understanding Crude Oil Prices, something he will hopefully help us do here today. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Hamilton.
Thank you, Brian. How's it sound? Can you hear me in the back okay? This is a graph of the inflation-adjusted price of crude oil going back to World War II. So when the price got up to $40 a barrel in 1980, if you put that in current dollars, it would be over $100. And you can see there were a couple of very dramatic moves up in oil prices in the 1970s. And here we are today. Looks like deja vu all over again. We know that those price increases earlier seem to be associated with significant economic disruptions. What I'll be talking about today is what were some of the causes and some of the economic effects of those earlier disruptions and what we might expect from that and what we seem to be seeing in terms of the current developments for the economy. Let me start with the causes of some of those historical oil price movements because that's the very easy question. Here's a graph of the oil production from three of the countries that have figured prominently in the history of the Middle East over the last 50 years. Iran at the top, Iraq in the middle, Kuwait at the bottom. What you're seeing on this graph is how much oil each of those countries was producing each month from 1973 up to 2007. And for example, in this top graph, Iran, you see there was a very dramatic drop in Iranian oil production in 1978 associated with the Iranian Revolution. It was a very big event for world oil markets. Prior to the revolution, Iran had been producing about 10% of the global petroleum supply. It was knocked out almost overnight. Iranian production recovered from that, but soon after, Iran went to war with Iraq. Iraq having been another of the main oil exporters at the time. And here you see both of those countries' production knocked out then by a second oil shock that came very close on the heels of the first. And those twin events, the Iranian Revolution, the Iran-Iraq War, were the principal things that drove that initial spike in oil prices up above $100 a barrel in current terms in 1980. You also see a third event on this diagram pretty dramatically. In 1990, the first Persian Gulf War, when essentially all of Iraq production and all of Kuwait's production was eliminated. That again was very dramatic in terms of its effects on oil prices, so that was a temporary spike up, albeit a large one, in an overall declining trend in real oil prices. And if you go back, you can find 5 episodes of this character. Some may be better examples than others, but 5 instances in which geopolitical events, such as these wars we just mentioned, resulted in a significant elimination of a substantial part of world oil production. Go back to the Suez Crisis in 1956, the Arab-Israeli War, the OPEC embargo in 1973-74, and then the 3 I just mentioned. Each of those, somewhere close to 10% of world oil production was knocked out. And in each of those, the world economy went into a recession shortly afterward. That's not to say that the oil shock caused the recession, but it certainly would raise a presumption that events like that have a potential to seriously exacerbate the economic situation. And what I'd like to do then first is to take a look at what were some of the effects of those earlier oil price shocks in terms of what they did to the economy. And one of the key numbers that I'll be focusing on in these remarks is the dollar amount that people are spending on oil relative to their total spending. So it's clear that in any of these events, people are in trouble, the oil prices go up, and pay more at the pump. The typical TV news story then goes to ask a bunch of people at the pump, well, how do you like that? And they say, well, we don't like it. As economists, we want to be a little more quantitative, and it's possible to be very precise here. We want to put everything in dollars and cents. And you can just measure what's the dollar amount people are spending on, for example, their gasoline, relative to their total dollars of spending on everything else. And that, in virtually any economic model, is the initial number you'd look at for what's the size of the effect you see in response. So, for example, one sort of ballpark beginning you might have for any story is, well, one thing people might do is they just go on buying as much gasoline as they did before. Well, if they're paying more for gasoline, they're going to have to cut their spending on something else. And that reduced spending on other items is going to have economic consequences. What's the magnitude of that relative to GDP? Well, to get that number, we would just take the dollar value of spending on oil relative to the total dollar value of GDP, and that would give us a ballpark estimate of the size of the shock that could come from this sort of effect. So that's a key number I'll be talking about in various applications here. How much are people spending on energy relative to their total spending? Okay, so first set of results I'd like to refer to come from a study by Lutz Killian and Paul Edelstein at the University of Michigan. And this is just a summary of historically what happened to consumer spending after energy prices went up. And the framework for this study was to put everything in terms of the fraction of spending that was potentially affected and the actual effect. So the horizontal axis here is measuring the effect of time after energy prices go up. And this graph is summarizing what happened to consumer spending 5 months, 10 months, 15 months after energy prices went up, where the scale of this graph is that energy prices went up by enough that it would have reduced their purchasing power 0.1%. So, for example, if you were spending 5% of your, you were spending 2% of your income on gasoline, and the price of gasoline went up 5%, 2% of your spending on gasoline, 5% increase would be a 0.1% reduction in your purchasing power. So if you went on buying the same amount of gasoline as before, you cut your spending on other stuff by 0.1%. So this is summarizing what people actually did. Now, there are all kinds of questions about causation. Can we refer effectiveness? It's just a statistical summary. On average, 1970 to 2007, what was the response of consumer spending to a 0.1% reduction in their purchasing power that was caused by a gasoline price increase? Question to that, please.
Well, does that take into account the fact that when the cost of transportation increases, the cost of supply increases?
No. The question is, does it take into account the secondary effects on other costs of the price increase? And the answer is it does not. As I say, at this point, I'm just showing the facts. This is historically the correlation we see in the data. And what we're going to want to get at is what explains it. But first, I want to make sure everybody knows what the correlation in the data show. So this solid line here is the estimate of what happens. And the dashed line are 95% confidence intervals. So when energy prices go up, people cut their consumption spending, logically enough. But there are a couple surprising things about this graph. The first is the scale. Energy prices reduced their purchasing power by 0.1%. But consumption spending fell by, when this is all done, 0.2%. People lose $1 in their purchasing power, they spend $2 less. So that's the first puzzle. What could account for that? Why would there be a bigger response of consumption spending than the initial shock to the consumer's budget? And the second thing that's maybe a little surprising about that graph is that it takes some time for these effects to occur. There's some effect within the first 3 months, but there's other effects being realized a year later. Now, what's going on with that? Well, one way we can get a little more information is to look at the specific components of consumer spending. This, again, is from the Edelstein-Gillian study. So these different graphs are different components of consumption spending. The same question. Energy prices go up 0.1%. How do different components of consumption spending respond in percentage terms? So the first panel is the one we just talked about. That's total consumption spending. The second panel is purchases of non-durable goods. That has a less dramatic response than total consumption spending. Services, a less dramatic response. Down here, the lower left, durables. Appliances, cars, those are the categories of spending where we're seeing a big response, big shifts in what consumers do. And then here, the lower middle panel is motor vehicles. And you can see, even if you're in the back of this room, I think the scale, this is a much huger thing. That's by far the most important thing going on. We see a big change in spending on motor vehicles. And that accounts for a fair chunk of why there's this bigger effect on total spending than the initial shock to the consumer budgets. Now, what sense does that make? Well, one thing consumers are doing is shifting the kinds of cars they're purchasing. Buying smaller cars, which tend to be cheaper, and that's less total spending on vehicles. One thing is going on. Another thing that seems to be happening is consumers are postponing their purchases altogether. Let me wait and see, where's this going to end up? I'm not sure what kind of car I'm going to buy. The result is that for a while we see lower purchases of everything. It also accounts potentially for why there's that delay. Some people are buying cars now. Some people are going to be buying whatever cars they buy a year from now. You're going to see a delayed response. And it also potentially explains some of that amplifier mechanism. Insofar as the people who were selling these cars and making these cars lose their jobs and lose some of their income, they reduce their spending. And that's another shock to the economy, in addition to the initial loss in spending from the first consumer paying a higher price for gasoline. So this suggests a mechanism higher gasoline prices, among other things, result in a reduction in purchases of things like cars, less income for the automakers. As we see cutbacks in employment and production in that sector, that has feedback effects for the rest of the economy. That's certainly consistent anyway with all these correlations. Here's a diagram from another study. This from my colleague Valerie Ramey and Tim Bresnahan. It's a plot for the U.S. auto industry looking at the 1970s here. This is 72 to 84. The reaction to how the U.S. auto industry fared in those first run-up in oil prices we talked about in the 1970s. And what this graph is showing is the capacity of different segments of the U.S. auto industry. So this thing at the top is the standard size car. And you can see that what happened in the 74-75 oil shock was there was a huge shift away from the standard size cars, which Detroit had been making. And eventually, they shifted production out of those resources, closed those lines. A big increase in demand for intermediate-sized cars there. And then as we had the further oil price increases in the later 70s, even those intermediate car sales from Detroit fell, and you have the compacts and subcompacts starting to climb up. So very significant dislocations, adjustments the U.S. auto industry made in response to those early events. And here, for example, going back again to the Killian Edelstein numbers, here's a graph of what happened, the relative spending on domestically manufactured cars relative to foreign manufactured cars. After a shock that raised the energy prices such that you had up to 0.1% to 1% loss in the purchasing power. So here's new domestic autos, foreign autos. So one of the things that happened was people shifted from buying U.S. manufactured cars to buying foreign manufactured cars. And again, even if they spent the same amount on cars, and they didn't, that's a shock to U.S. income in terms of the U.S. producers of that resource. So that certainly is part of what is going on here. One other category, you can look at auto sales relative to light trucks. Light trucks, of course, includes the SUV category, and here you can see in response is those light truck sales, the right-hand panel, that get hit the most. So this all suggests that an important part of the amplification mechanism is consumers cut back their purchases on particular items. Big U.S. cars being the most dramatic example. Particular items for which there is specific capital and specific labor specialized in producing that item. When those producers see the demand for their product disappear, as it did in these occasions, they make cutbacks. That has multiplicative consequences for the rest of the economy. And indeed, if we go back, for example, to 4 of those episodes, 4 of those oil shocks we mentioned, 74, 79, 81, 90, we can look at the immediate aftermath of those shocks, what happened to average GDP growth in the 4 quarters after those events. Now, in a healthy year, we've seen that grow maybe 3.5%, over 3% growth. In a recession, you see a decline. So the middle panel here is indicating the magnitude of the decline, or our sluggish growth. And the right-hand panel is showing what that number would be if we just took autos out of the picture. You just look at just that one sector, what was it contributing? And the answer is it was making a material contribution, somewhere on the order of 0.5% of the total decline we see just came from autos alone in these recessions. So unquestionably, that was one mechanism whereby these historical events were contributing to the downturns that we saw, though other things were also involved as well. Okay. And then another thing from that Gillian Edelstein study that's kind of interesting. This is looking at the Michigan Index of Consumer Sentiment, asking people questions such as, are you better off now than you were a year ago? Do you think you're going to be better off a year from now than you are today? And what we see is a real decline in that sentiment following an oil price increase historically. Consumers get worried. They say they're worried. And it's not entirely clear what the causal connection is there. Maybe partly they're worried because this is part of their income that they're losing and they don't know how to make their budget work anymore. Maybe there's certainly some worry on the part of the automakers and other directly affected enterprises. There's reason to be concerned. Maybe it's some of the events themselves. As I mentioned, these were dramatic geopolitical events we're talking about, major wars, unclear scenario. In any case, this is something in the data. There's this response of consumer sentiment, and that surely is also another factor in this whole amplification mechanism. Another factor of why consumers were cutting their spending by even more than they had to based on the sheer physical necessity of what this did to their budget. Okay, and now I'd like to look at some of that historical data from a different perspective before I get to the issue of what's likely going on at the moment. So this is a graph that summarizes both GDP growth on the horizontal axis and energy use on the vertical axis going back to World War II. So every year for the last half century or so is a point on this graph. And over time we move to the right and up. Over time we move to the right in having a higher GDP. Most years we have a higher GDP than the year before. So occasionally we see a move to the left, which is an economic recession, where GDP stops growing and starts declining. And most years we move up on this graph. Most years we increase our energy use. So there's some years where there's a decrease, and these are all the years basically of those energy shocks, previous energy shocks we're talking about. So the most dramatic thing on this graph, I suppose, is that downward move there. That comes at the late 1980s. That's the response of those big oil shocks at the end of the 70s we talked about. And we can look at that episode and observe that the energy price went up about 80% there in the space of a couple of years, and people actually reduced their petroleum consumption by 20%. It's by far the biggest drop in petroleum use you see in the U.S. over that period. And it's basically making the point that, yes, the U.S. economy can adjust. We can reduce our petroleum consumption, even with growing GDP. This episode is the prime example. But doing so was quite painful on that occasion. We went through 2 recessions, which show up as 2 leftward moves there. By the end of it, we're back to growing GDP. By the end of it, we've got adjusted to a lower energy use. But we could do it. Now, economists like to focus on those percentages. There was a 20% reduction in energy use, but an 80% increase in the price. The price increased much more in percentage terms than the use responded. And we summarize that as the price elasticity of demand was very small. And that's actually the biggest response you see. So, for example, if you look at the very end of that graph, you also see we're in an episode where energy use is decreasing. And yet it's decreased nowhere near as dramatically as in, say, the early 1980s. And yet we saw, as the point of this graph anyway, a 40% increase in the price over a couple of years, and only a 1% reduction in energy in oil use. So there's still some responsiveness of demand, but it's much smaller. So two things we take away from this graph so far. Oil use does respond to the price, but it's hard to do it. It takes a big price increase for much of the response. And second, that responsiveness seems to be substantially lower here in the most recent data than it was in the beginning. There's a much bigger response to a given price change here in 1980 than there seems to be in 2005, 2006. I'll talk about why I think that is in a moment. First, let me just focus on another aspect of this graph, which is the slope. So remember, we're looking at GDP on the horizontal axis and energy use on the vertical. The slope is telling us how much our energy use grows when our economy grows. And your first thought might be we'd have a slope of about 1. That if our economy grows 1%, our energy use would grow 1%, which would be an income elasticity of 1. And that's what we saw in the second half of the 19th century, up through about 1970 or so. We did see a slope of something like 1. That our economy was growing at about the same rate as our energy use from 1945 to 1970. On the other hand, if you look at the more recent data, for example, here, the 1980s and 1990s, even after the oil price was coming down, you see a much flatter slope. That our energy use is growing more slowly than GDP. And that's not just in artifact of U.S. data, but that's something you can see in lots of other data sets. For example, here's a graph of energy, petroleum demand growth increase in France, Japan, and Germany. You follow those countries from 1960 to 2000. Basically, petroleum demand was growing very rapidly in those countries in 1960. As the countries became richer and more developed, petroleum demand slowed down. So there's a lot of evidence of this, basically, that as a country becomes more developed, their energy use starts to grow more slowly than GDP. The U.S. is in that mode now, has been for a number of years. Western Europe is in that mode now, has been for a number of years. I have some more data that illustrate those points. I don't know that I want to dwell on too much. I want to get to some other points. But let me just state that it seems to be the case that in early stage development, you see energy use grow at the same rate as the economy. Later on, such as the U.S. is in today, energy growth is slower than economic growth. Okay, now let me pull all this together. So we've seen a couple of things. One, that the energy growth now is slower than GDP. And what that means is that each year, we'll be increasing our oil consumption by less than GDP is growing. And that's a factor that should lead over time to a falling dollar share of GDP in total output. If we're growing our economy faster than we're growing our use of oil, that share of oil in the economy should fall. Some people attribute this to more efficiency in the economy. You hear people talk about it. I think you're missing the boat. It's really just a process of development. Every developed country is going to go through this. It's going to do this whether it's, regardless of what's happening to the price of oil. So that means that this dollar share, this first measure of how big a shock this is to the economy, would be declining over time. The U.S. economy should be less sensitive to oil shocks today than it was in 1970 from this factor. The second thing, very clear in the data, is that that response of quantity demanded to the price is also less than the price in percentage terms. Now what that means is that when the price of oil is rising, your share of your budget going to oil goes up. If I have the same amount of oil, the price goes up, you're paying a higher fraction of your income on oil than you used to. The price goes down, you're paying a smaller fraction than you used to. So this second factor means that as the price of oil declined relative to other goods overall from 1980 to 1998, that price coming down also meant a lower share of our spending was going to oil. So two things happened during the 80s and 90s. Economic growth and lower oil prices, the combined effect of which was we were spending much less of our income on oil in 1998 than we had been in 1980. Here's the prices again. So the big price increase, remember in the 1970s, big price drop overall despite the 1991 spike, big price drop overall to 98, and then a big price increase since then. So here's what's happening to that share. So this is a graph of the dollar share of oil in GDP. It's a very rough calculation. Just take the total quantity of oil we use, weighted by the price of West Texas Intermediate, divide by U.S. GDP. So it's a share, it's a fraction. And you can see what happened in the 1970s was that share went way up. It had been below 2%. By 1980, it was up to 8%. And that's a consequence of the fact that the price went up so much. We reduced our consumption a little bit, but mostly we were still buying it. The share went way up. Economic growth and the lower price then brought that down to 1998, where by 1998, that share had fallen, had been 8%, was down to 1%. Now, that means, first, that in 1998, the economy should have been much less vulnerable to an oil supply disruption than it was in 1980. People would respond much less. Second, in my opinion, it accounts for what we saw in terms of that responsiveness to price. We mentioned, it's kind of surprising there in 2004, 2005, the price was going up and consumers seemed to be ignoring it. My explanation for that is consumers were ignoring it because they could afford to. They could afford to ignore those price increases in 2004, 2005 because this had become such a smaller part of their budget relative to what it was historically. And it did not have the same kind of impact on the economy as those earlier price increases. Didn't see the same set of big responses as we had in the 1970s. So I think people are right to say in the 1970s this was a really big deal, exerting big disruptive effects on the economy. I think people were right to say that in the early 2000s this had become something much less critical for the economy. People could ignore it and did. But the point I want to make with this diagram is that you've got to update your conventional wisdom for the latest data. The point is that as that oil price has been going up so dramatically, that share is climbing back up. Now, here, this graph shows is based on the 2008 first quarter number. That's where we're getting this 5.2%, $98 a barrel. We're up 30% from that. So, my view is that, yes, consumers were ignoring this for the most part a couple of years ago. There's no way they can ignore it now. It's a bigger part of their budget. You can't afford to ignore this. And I think we are now seeing the kinds of responses that we saw historically to some of those earlier disruptions. So, for example, this is from the highway transportation count. They make a physical count of the number of cars on the road. Estimate of how many miles people are driving. And this is a time series plot. You can see it takes a lot to make that number go down. And yet down it is. That's a 4% drop annually, the latest available number. People are definitely driving less. You see that with these counts of the number of cars on the road. It's a response we weren't seeing before, We are seeing now, because consumers can't ignore this anymore. Here's a plot of U.S. gasoline use. Current year is in red, previous year is in blue. Again, the usual thing you see, we're using more gasoline each year than the year before. Not anymore. We're actually using less gasoline. A bigger country is using less gas now than we did a year ago. Consumers are responding. Here's one that I'm particularly interested in. This is sales of light trucks, which includes the SUV category, that are manufactured in North America. And so there's seasonal components to that, as well as trends. You can see them all if you stare at this graph long enough. It's a plot for any given month. For example, May here. You can see what were the May light truck sales in 2004, 2005, 6, 7, and 8, and so on. You follow any given year if you want to weed out the seasonal factors by just looking along a given month there. And what you see in this picture is first there's a trend. There's been a move away, a gradual move away from the light trucks over the past several years. Some people making those responses, but not a very dramatic thing. Until this year, and these last numbers are dramatic. So that's I don't have the number, that's a 26% drop, for example, the May figures for light trucks manufactured in North America relative to a year ago. And that's a big deal. It's a big deal that the U.S. automakers are facing now with the new data. Yes, we've been talking about higher oil prices for a long time, but there's a challenge now that wasn't there a year ago. How does it compare with, say, the previous oil shock we talked about, the 1990-91 oil shock? Well, so in that episode, if you look at what happened, say, to GDP coming from motor vehicles and parts, just that one sector, between third quarter of 90 and the first quarter of 1991, that was down $49 billion. If you looked at what happened between the third quarter of 2007 and the first quarter of this year, it was down $43 billion. Roughly a pretty comparable shock to the U.S. automakers that they saw was in the data through the first quarter of this year, compared to in that earlier episode that we saw was associated with a recession. Now, it is true that the auto industry is smaller relative to the economy as a whole today than it was in 1990. So if you put that in terms of as a fraction of GDP, that would be a 0.7% shock to GDP in 1990-91. It'd be only 0.4%. However, this is just for the first quarter. There's really troubling numbers we're looking at for the second quarter numbers. So this is definitely a substantial shock. If you look at employment, people who have their job in the auto sector, that fell by 88,000 during that oil shock of 1990-91. We've seen over 100,000 jobs decrease the comparable period in the most recent episode. So we are in a new situation as far as the auto industry. Yes, they've been hurting for a while, but we're seeing now that the kind of pace of the response that it really is a challenge for this sector. And in terms of new information, GM's announced that it's going to close a number of plants. Ford's going to cut 15% of its positions. I've just been talking about the auto industry. Of course, there's a number of other industries responding. A number of airlines announcing cuts of thousands of positions and significant responses. And there'll be a variety of categories of spending. But now your specific categories are being cut, and that's going to be affecting particular industries. Just to give one other example, this is from Temecula, California, a community close to me in San Diego. Well, not all that close, it's about 60 miles actually from downtown San Diego. So it's one of these exurban communities. It's way out there, but it was a little bit cheaper housing. And some people were buying houses there, commuting into San Diego. Population doubled last decade. They're having real problems now. 15% of the homes in Temecula right now are in foreclosure. And this is another example of what I'm saying, where the shock to initial budget calculations is translating into a much bigger shock than for the specific affected sectors. Unemployment rate, one of the traditional things we see in a recession is that spikes up. So the shaded areas here are economic recessions, and I personally was very concerned about the latest number, that going up to 5.5%. Consumer sentiment. Again, that's another component of these historical developments. This is a plot of that consumer sentiment index. The shaded areas here are economic recessions. As you can see, there's a lot of noise in this series. You can't draw too much inference from it. But there's no question consumers are very worried. And it's been a relatively recent development. Lots of factors in that. First-hand persuaded, one factor is definitely the energy prices. So in other words, I see a lot of the developments right now in the most recent data that are similar to what we saw in some of these historical episodes. I think the reason why we're seeing these responses only now and not earlier is that consumers could earlier afford to ignore them, and they can't now. Now, these shocks, I think the economy is more diversified now, so if it were just the problems with the auto sector and the airlines and the exurban communities and the tourism and all the other affected, I think the U.S. economy could probably withstand that. And on the other hand, if we just had the problems with housing, I think the economy could withstand that. We've got both of them going on now, and this is a significant challenge. There is one bright spot. Retail sales were very strong last month. Maybe some of you saw. That may be related to fiscal stimulus. That's an offsetting factor. On the other hand, it's not going to cause people to buy the particular kind of cars that they were before. Good thing in some ways, but a bad thing if you're in the particular sector that was getting your job, your income from producing that kind of car. Okay. And I should also mention, I guess, the trade deficit. This didn't come through at all. I don't know if it's better on your diagram. It should be red and blue here, red and black. Anyway, the point is that another cost of the oil price increases is in terms of our trade deficit. Why is the trade deficit a concern? Well, we're talking about a significant amount here. It's roughly $60 billion a month. Increase in the price of oil definitely translates into an increased burden there. And that $60 billion a month has to be financed somehow, either by sales of U.S. assets or increased indebtedness of U.S. residents to foreigners. So, for example, if you were to try to finance a trade deficit of $60 billion a month by selling off ownership of U.S. assets, you'd have to sell off 3 companies the size of Unical, which you remember was a bit of a controversy a couple of years when that came up, selling off that particular company. You have to sell off 3 of them each month to finance a trade deficit of $60 billion. It's a lot of money we're talking about, and potentially destabilizing our capital markets. So that's another concern in addition to the specific recessionary stimulus I talked about. Now, I was asked to make a few remarks also about the causes of the price increases. I don't have a lot of time, which is maybe a good thing, because we could talk about it all day, but I want to make one big point about the biggest factor in the price increase, which is demand. So this is a graph here of the change in demand for oil between 2003 and 2006 in terms of where it's coming from. And the point is that although the U.S. and Europe are the biggest consumers of oil, the biggest increase in demand has come from the newly industrialized countries. China, all by itself, accounts for 1/3 of the increase in global petroleum demand over these 3 years. And China, India, and Brazil are in this early stage of development at which energy use is growing at the same rate as GDP. In addition, you have the oil-producing countries. Their demand for oil is increasing substantially. So there's been a big growth in demand. We talk about China in particular. They have a 7% growth rate per year in petroleum consumption going back 20 years. Roughly the same as their economic growth rate. Roughly what you'd expect given the phenomenal growth they've had. But if you try to project that out, say, okay, 7% a year, let's ask what if. What if that goes on a couple more years? Well, by 2020, China would be using 20 million barrels a day if this goes on. That's as much as the U.S. China would be another U.S. by 2020. Give it another decade, they'd be using 40 million barrels a day. Twice what the U.S. is. And I don't care how optimistic your scenario, for all the oil out there, there's no way the world's going to produce 40 million barrels a day from China, let alone India and Brazil and the Middle East countries, and how about us? It's just not going to happen. What has happened, this is another thing, is this totally crazy to say that China could do that? Well, in China today, 3.3 cars for every 100 people. 30 Chinese in a room, on average one of them would have a car. U.S. that number is 77 per 100. There's room for a lot of growth in China. Or another way to put it, China today consumes 1/3 of the oil per person as Mexico. China could triple their oil consumption, and they'd be doing what Mexico is doing. So yes, there's a potential there. How about production? Well, world production is stagnating. World production, 2005 to 2007, didn't grow at all. You had this strong demand. Newly industrialized countries and the oil-producing countries. Something had to give. What was it? Well, the U.S. and Europe had to be persuaded to consume less. What did it take to do that? Energy prices had to rise to a high enough share where people were paying attention to it again. And that's basically what happened. Now, to say, we can talk about a lot of other issues. I know there are a lot of them, and I'm sympathetic to them. But this is the single most important factor, in my opinion, and one to keep in mind. Okay, well, I have some other slides, but maybe I should stop there for questions. Because I didn't want to allow some questions. Yes,
Commodity speculation.
okay. Well, I do have some slides. So, I think commodity speculation has been a factor, particularly in the last few months, as oil prices have gone up dramatically in the absence of new news about these fundamentals we're talking about. And that coincided with the decline in the value of the dollar. And I think there's no question, decline in the value of the dollar, increase in commodities prices, and decline in U.S. interest rates are a factor in the latest increases in oil prices. As I say, I think it's a mistake to think of that as first thing. However, just going to make one point I made in one idea about China and the oil-producing countries stagnating its production. But certainly there has been a contribution to that. Let me just briefly mention, to the extent we are concerned about what are some of the policy options that could be on the table. Well, the U.S. Federal Reserve is a single institution that's played the biggest role, I think, in the decline in the dollar. The interest differential between the U.S. and Europe is a key factor that's been driving this. I think the Fed brought interest rates down too quickly and too aggressively. That certainly fanned the flames. That would be the first place to start. And in addition, we stopped adding to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. I think that's a good move. I think we should also explore what would happen if we sold some oil out of it. And in particular, we could sell futures contracts and force delivery of those with the oil in storage and see whether that provides some more liquidity for the market and breaks any of the psychology of speculation. So those are a couple of policies that I think would be worth exploring in addressing this. I am sympathetic to the view that there's definitely a contribution in the most recent data of these events to oil prices.
Where is the speculation occurring? If you look at the OPEC report, it shows that non-commercial purchase contracts is down about 70%. So where is it happening? Is it happening in the North Sea? Is it happening in Mexico? Where is this speculation happening?
The volume of index fund investments, which are doing things like tracking the Goldman Sachs commodity index. And so these are synthetic instruments which indicate the return you get if you were to buy the near-term futures contract on, for example, NYMEX, and then sell that and buy the succeeding position when the next month comes. And there's been something like $250 billion in funds flowing into that in the last couple of years.
Well, when you look at the graphs of Chinese consumption futures, doesn't that explain why people buy oil and hold oil?
Absolutely. That's why I wanted to make that point first.
That's not speculation.
No, it isn't, and that's exactly my point. That is a fundamental, and it's a very important fundamental, and a very critical one. Now, I don't think there has been critical news about that Chinese growth since January. There has been significant moves in oil prices since January. What do those moves correlate with? They correlate with the depreciation of the dollar and a decline in U.S. interest rates relative to other countries' interest rates. U.S. interest rates getting below the expected inflation rate. And so I believe there has been a contribution to the most recent data from that.
Yeah, I was curious if you have gone already with any quantitative data relating the effects of how much of an increase in the price of oil would be calculated into a, say, increase in interest rates. Are there any quantitative studies that show the effects of oil price increases in relationship to the effects of interest rate increases?
Jeff Frankel has some estimates along those lines. I personally would be very suspicious of it. Following up on the previous question, the reason that I think it's very hard to give definitive, clear answers to this is that if you knew for sure, well, speculators have misjudged the price at this level, it's fundamental, then you know for sure how to make millions of dollars out of this contract by taking the other position. So it's because there is uncertainty about how are we going to meet this Chinese demand. What is going to really happen in Saudi Arabia? It's an inherently uncertain fact, and so that's why in speculation is making a contribution. It's so difficult to disentangle and put a quantitative measure on it. So, no, I do not have such an estimate. There are some estimates out there, but I'm not confident in them. I'm going, though, with the lucid correlation. I think for the last couple of weeks, the news, it's news about the dollar that certainly seems to correlate with and speculation about interest rates. So the day that we had a wild move in oil prices going up $11 a barrel came after this European Central Bank said they were going to raise the rate. The U.S. unemployment numbers came out, adding the speculation the U.S. might reduce the rate further. My heart's been quiet. A week after, the Fed said, no, we're going to be raising rates, and that's what calmed the markets back down. Again, yesterday, when it was a wild day, up and down, again, speculation on the dollar. So it's not something I have a quantitative estimate for, but I do think I see a correlation against
Through several of the graphs you have some that are showing the cyclic nature of the economy, unemployment being one of those, goes up and down. Through, on page 11, you have four graphs that show from 1990 projected to 2010 and 2030, depending on the graph you're looking at. Over that time period, the cyclic nature of the economy seems to have been allowed because while consumption's been going up, it still has production. If we're hitting a plateau in production, what evidence is there that leads you to think that we're going to be able to have that uptick back in the economic cycle?
My position is we have to be extremely cautious about extrapolating these short-term correlations into something we've never really experienced before. So a decline in global production, if that were to persist, is, to my way of thinking, a new regime. And I'm not confident at all about what the nature of the adjustments were. What I have studied historically is, as you say, these cyclical adjustments, the recession, the consequence of reallocating. Eventually, those auto manufacturers did make the smaller cars. Eventually, we did get around those adjustments. But you're exactly right. I've been emphasizing just these short-run disruptions. And if it is a permanent adjustment we have to make now, that produces some new challenges. One of the key ones that I would emphasize as the long-run adjustment is the one I was talking about in terms of the trade deficit. That's a long-term issue that
you touched on the impact of the airline industry. Can you explain a little bit more on who that affects, as far as which travelers, what's different from the business traveler, and how much will the business environment be able to set for what?
Well, one of the key ways in which airlines can improve their fuel efficiency is by packing the planes full. It's a more efficient flight if you have it full. And that's one of the primary vehicles the airlines are trying to use. And the way they do that is by cutting costs. So I don't know that that's the reason I think that is significant is not so much in terms of the business travel, although I have seen estimates that the hassle of flying is contributing to the use of that. But in terms of the direct employment effects, they're cutting the flights, they're cutting workers. And again, this is a case where if you used to have that job and now you don't, the shock to your personal income is much greater than this shock to the purchasing power that we talked about setting it off at the initial case. So the significance to me of those airline responses is what happens to the income of people in the airline industry.
How much does the Chinese government's suppression of oil prices weigh on Chinese?
Well, that's a contributing factor, and I would emphasize even more in some of these oil-producing countries where the huge subsidies and sort of down to that feeling. But in addition, I point to those long-run trends I was talking about. That China is at a point where their petroleum demand is going to increase at the rate of their economic growth with stable prices. That would be absolutely what we expect to see in China from the vast historical experience and what we are seeing. And I think that's by far the most important fundamental. They're having that real economic growth. And people want to have cars. And so I think the price in China is a secondary issue.
If, given current prices, how long do you think it would take in China to get to the point where energy use is not growing at the same rate if they continue at the same rate?
I don't have a specific estimate for that. But the point is, it took a lot. I mean, that's the basic fact here. That price has been going up, and the Chinese demand has still been increasing. So whatever it is, it's higher than $100 a barrel. It looks to me.
Well, not to belabor this, but the subsidy part of the story is a big part. There are a lot of countries that are subsidizing the domestic price of fuel. If you took that wedge out, we don't really know what would happen. The governments of these countries are afraid that their economic development will collapse, which is why they subsidize. But with the price going up and up and up, some of them are now starting to fall away and can't afford it anymore. China can afford it for a while, but the price is a big part of what's going to happen.
Well, I agree with that. But part of the nature of the subsidy in all these cases is the prices have been going up for the consumer, just not as fast as the world price. And I think it's a mistake then to say, well, it was that subsidy that was the cause of the whole process going up. I think it's more accurate to say that subsidy is a monkey wrench in the adjustment system. It means that there was a bigger adjustment needed from the U.S. and Europe, for example. And that's certainly part of what we see. But these are strong forces, and if China and India are no longer poor, they're going to want these transportation services. They're going to want them even at a much higher price than gasoline services. So yes, I agree with you. Yes, that's policy we ought to be promoting in those countries. But I think it would be a mistaken focus to think, well, that's the whole problem. I think it's
China's economy is based, at least in some part, on manufacturing and industry. How much does this energy crisis hurt China's growth? Do we expect the same rates of growth because they're so manufacturing intensive?
Well, that's a good question. Now, oil in particular is a transportation energy source. So really we're talking about the transportation. That's by far the most important factor. You can run your manufacturing on a variety of sources. China has abundant coal resources, for example. I think it's a mistake to think of the manufacturing per se as the factor driving the Chinese demand. I think it's the income growth and the desire for transportation that comes from it. I didn't have the automobile sales numbers for Japan, but they are really kind. When I see real growth, look at auto sales in China. Look at auto sales in China. That's been quite
Can you expound on what you mean by the administration could sell futures contracts?
Well, so We're talking, for example, about the August oil futures contract. There's a buyer and there's a seller. And the concern is that the buyers are outnumbering the sellers. The buyers coming from these hedge funds, pension funds, making investments in commodities, and that this market is not sufficiently liquid. There aren't enough people on the sell side. So I'm just saying the U.S. federal government could be selling those contracts. Sell, for example, 100,000 barrels a day for a week out of the SPR for delivery Cushing, Oklahoma in August, and just see what happens, see what that does to the market.
I mean, I think the challenge with that proposal is that in a futures contract, for every buyer, there's a seller. Buyers always equal sellers. And so it sounds to me like this is a proposal to solve the problem with speculation on the long side by having the government speculate by being on the short side.
Exactly. That's
in a
exactly
long-term
what
bull
it is.
market, is that a good use of taxpayer dollars?
Well, it's actually a profit of taxpayer dollars. We'd be selling at a higher price than we bought it.
Not if you're going short. If you're selling futures and the price goes...
No, we're selling the oil. That's what we'll take the physical oil out of the SPR, physically deliver that in Cushing, Oklahoma in August. So it's not speculation, it's a sale.
So you're talking about trying to use the strategic petroleum reserve to drive the futures market lower by delivering the supply of strategic petroleum reserve?
To see what happens. As I say, there's a question, and in my mind it's unclear. What's the relative contribution of the index fund speculation in its total price? There are those who argue that there's enough volume on the buy side and there aren't enough sellers, and that's part of why the market is responding the way it is. I'm not certain the degree to which that is true, but it strikes me as a plausible hypothesis. And relatively low-cost thing the government could do is just try it and see. Let's sell 500,000 barrels and see what happens. And if nothing, well, then we go on to plan C.
I see your point from a hypothesis, but I think I think that this is something that will deserve a lot more study before just trying to throw something up this that could have such drastic consequences as this thrown it like spaghetti on the wall to see what happens.
I'm seeing the grass about this.
I think that's a huge suggestion.
I think in one sense, that would be less drastic than going in and trying to screw around with commodities markets.
It'd be far less drastic.
You're saying this is the place that demands a public solution. I would rather see you say, okay, well, let's go in as a seller if you think this is the lever that's going to move the market, than to go in and say, okay, let's screw around with potentially a huge price discovery mechanism in our economy. But
Doing this is screwing around with the commodity markets by delivering against the futures contract is screwing with commodities.
I don't think it's fair at all. It's just providing some additional supply to the market. And maybe
you're going to supply additional supply to the market to just sell it out of the strategic petroleum reserve
you could do that.
instead of using it as a delivery tool against Cushing.
I'm just addressing the specific concern that maybe there's an absence of liquidity in this particular market. The market for August delivery improved. And see what happens. But yeah, ultimately, you're talking about physical delivery. I don't think it is a big deal. And I think I agree very much with what was said. It's a much more modest. The problem with margin requirements or something like this is there's a buyer and a seller in these contracts. And you're going to discourage buyers and sellers with added margin requirements. Margin requirements matter more for the seller than the buyer in the contract. So to me, it's a very modest.
I'm a little unclear on the purpose of the SPR. I think of it as a strategic reserve there in case you need it for military action or some huge crisis, and not as a hedge against the market. How much is in there, and how is that going to change the fundamentals underlying prices of the market, particularly considering my previous question on China's consumption? If you put this on the market, which is essentially a world market, you're simply dislocating oil in the United States for the benefit of all other consumers in the world.
Yeah, that's a valid point. But it's, I think it's worth a try. And if nothing happens, the worst that would happen is we make a slight profit for the government by selling it at a higher price than we bought. That's the worst outcome, and there's less to deal with the.
But you got to refill it later if the purpose of the reserve is to have a reserve, which is at a higher price than at which you are buying it today and currently on hold.
Right. Well, okay, it's not free, but I think it's an option we should have on the table.